Sorry about that. Go ahead.
That's okay. Um, we were harvesting so much peppers and tomatoes and eggplants from the high tunnel um, all the way through the second week of November, and that was great. I wouldn't do it differently, but we made a mistake. We did not pay attention to what was happening in the middle of the season enough to realize that we really needed to have our our overwintering and winter growing crops in queue so that we could immediately transition. You know, by the time we got them in late May, well, we just didn't get them started early enough in the summer to in late in early fall, maybe actually summer, late summer, in August, September. We didn't get those cool weather crops started, and they were not mature enough to really thrive in the high tunnel. And that would be the same thing with um, the low tunnel. And what we did well this year, and I didn't have a picture, is that we did put spring onions, and they're doing really well in the low tunnels. We could have also have put carrots into a high tunnel. I mean, a low tunnel. We could do them in the high tunnel as well, but this is what I mean about knowing what crops do well under these circumstances. So the three champs of the overwintering and actually during wintering harvest were, correct that, that overwintering and wintering harvesting, that's hands down the spinach. But the overwintering would be carrots and spring onions. And there are farmers in Massachusetts that will just do rows and rows upon rows of carrots that they plant in the fall and onions that they plant in the fall, and they just leave them alone and come back to them in spring and start harvesting them in the spring. Sometimes, depending on when they start, they can be harvested in during the winter, but generally it's that's an overwintering. But getting back to this notion, what happens in between, and what happens in between that you have to have these plants in a situation where they are established, and that's where the concept of let's go back to that. Ooh, okay. Uh, I I killed this word on the pronunciation. Forgive me for that. Is paraphone um, period. That is the time in the fall when fall begins and it's accompanied by a continuous decrease in sunlight. So you don't want to plant your um, shoulder crops going too much against that decrease in sunlight, because the reality is um, that they're not going to grow. They'll survive, but they're not going to grow. So if they're not going to grow that much, then you don't really have much to harvest. However, if you have timed it just right, these crops you can um, take some of them and cut some as you would with a some of the greens, especially collards and kale, and leave the other ones to wait until we begin spring and the daylight starts to increase. And that's the rhythm. That's why it is very important to know what's happening in the middle of the season, where really that's when the fruiting crops are taking over and they demand attention, and they're hogging all the attention most of the time. You still gotta if you're going to grow in the shoulders, you still have to be mindful of what it is that you're going to grow and get ready. If you have an ability, a side greenhouse, you could start your fall greens in there. But if you don't, then your best bet is something like the Trustees fall winter sale. I mean, fall sale. And, you know, like I said in one of the slides, we were very successful the first year because we really had Michelle and Annabelle on our side backing us up, and we didn't realize that, you know, it wasn't just any time that you could get cool weather crops. Another entity that was just very helpful, of course, is UFI, as well as the food project. We got a lot of seedling that first year, but that is a chance thing. You know, maybe there was not enough, and we actually did get some from the Trustees, and they were wonderful. Kale in particular, and other cool season crops, and they started off, they took off marvelously, but of course then disease set in, and that's, you know, this is a learning curve. So you do want to be mindful of your plants as you go along. In a high tunnel, that's a special situation. We needed to better manage our water, but in a smaller growing operation, that is easier to do. So I don't know how we're doing for time. Annabelle?
We have some time. Yeah.
Okay. So can you give me a time check as we go?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's like 3:05.
Okay. All right. So let's before we wrap up, well, let's take some questions, and then I'll wrap it up. How's that? I see that there's 5 chats, 5 comments in the chat. We don't have that many folks on this on the workshop, but if there are any of those questions, we could take those now, and then I'll begin to wrap up.
Does anyone have anything they want to ask? You can unmute yourself. I have some questions I'd like to ask too, while people are thinking. So for the soil thermometer, do you have recommendations of what the thermometers work?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
So if you're measuring the temperature of the soil, can you use like any thermometer, or there are specific thermometers?
No, you know, I think that you're better off getting a soil thermometer. They tend to be longer, and at a minimum, you want something that is at least 6 inches long, because that's the sweet spot for soil. They are not that expensive. Places that I've gotten some shorter ones are Tractor Supply, also Harbor Freight Tools.
But is it like, so it is a soil thermometer, or it's like
what makes a soil thermometer, good question, I got it now, is that the length, because you want to be able to get to a good depth. Sometimes is a foot, sometimes it is at least 6 inches.
Got it. But there's nothing like, can you use those like turkey thermometers?
You know, I've been tempted to do those. I think that those will be all right. I just don't know how durable they are, so I kind of stay away from them. But I have actually used some to get a reading, knowing that my reading is not going to be forced as deep as I want it. Though, if you know, the surface, presumably the deeper in the soil, the warmer that it would be.
Okay. Anyone else have a question?
Okay, so let's see.
The pictures are amazing. I mean, yeah, I guess, I mean, you talked a bit about plants, but like specifically plants, like if someone's trying specific for early spring versus late fall, though maybe you have a couple more slides, but that is something.
No, I actually did not get those in. My apologies. I meant to,
No,
because
no, no, no
that's
worries.
something that folks really, but you know, what I would say is that you can use the Farmer's Almanac, and uh, you can navigate their site and get their recommendations for what to grow in our hardiness zone. And just so that people who might not be familiar, I imagine that everyone is, but just in case, hardiness zones is it's a map that lays out what grows within a particular zone best, and you know, it is accompanied by a number of growing days. And if you do the one from Massachusetts, this is very interesting that the growing season in Dorchester is way shorter than the growing season in downtown Boston. And we know this is because of the heat island effect. But I was shocked by that, and when I was planning for helping do a crop plan for the Old West Church in Cambridge, just down the street from the Kennedy building. But that is a tool that I would that I really recommend, and it also has the recommended crops for that site for that are cold hardy, and they'll rate it for you based on that temperature. Some of these crops are amazing. They could go down close to freezing. Some of them will freeze and come back, but I don't have that readily available, and I don't want to go from memory. But that is a site that is definitely worth looking at for that purpose. And again, a lot of the crops that you would have, you know, are seedlings are provided or by the trustees, and anything that on your planting chart says after the frost or before the frost or even after the frost, you know, you want to pay particular attention to those, because that's a hint as to what their degree of being frost tolerant. And one of my favorites to eat but not to grow is Brussels sprouts, because they can, you know, and even actually even bok choy is something that will, you know, take on the snow and keep on ticking, even without protection. So that's a plant that is a good candidate for a little protection.
There's a question in the chat. Hold on one second. Does the amount of light allowance matter when buying a cover for plants? I guess.
Oh, very good, very good question. And it actually reminds me of a point that I forgot to make about row cover. Row cover is a sort of an entire chapter on itself, because it depends on how it is rated. You want row cover that allows maximum lighting while doing its job. And there are some that will permit a high percentage in the 90s of the light. So depending on the frost tolerance of your plant, you might want to go for something lighter. But you're often not going to be taking it on, putting it on and taking it off. Sometimes not, but you know, that could be a situation. And but not all row cover is this equal or the same. Some of it would allow more, some of it would allow less. So that's a good question. And the seed company, supply companies, Harris, for example, Johnny's has a rating charts for the row cover and recommendations, as along with plastic mulch, which again I tend to stay away from.
Do you, I mean, does the amount of light, because I guess if you have temperature, like let's say you're able to control for temperature, you know, it's super warm in your high tunnel or your low tunnel, but then the amount of light based on the season, how does that impact like what you're growing in the lower light times?
Well, we need to make a distinction between what's going to stay alive and what is going to actually not just stay alive, but grow. And that does depend on the length of on the amount of sunlight. You know, full sun sometimes is associated with 12 hours of sunlight. But there are plants that grow in the shade well. And some of the ones that are at the shoulders typically like the shade. But make no doubt, have no doubt about it that the amount of light will affect how much your plants grow. Now, if you're growing indoors or growing in a container that you bring indoors, you know, your plants could benefit from some full spectrum lighting that you can get at a price. But again, you know, some of this is kind of coming to terms with eating seasonally and not trying to push the envelope. But if you feel compelled, there are ways of doing it. You know, you can do that. But as far as going, your plants being in a low tunnel, the amount of light that the day provides, depending on the season, is going to be a factor. Right now, we're towards the end of March, and we're getting significant amount of sunlight, and it's warm, so that combination works to our advantage. And definitely, if you take advantage of some season extension techniques, you would be rewarded.
Yeah, that's
But
a
it
really
might,
good
you know,
point.
yeah.
Yeah. Like if you're not thinking about growing in December, but especially in this early spring, there's already so much light. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, and you know, there's stuff that goes kind of into hibernation and then takes off in the spring, and it's just amazing when that slide with the yellow brassicas, the leaves, which are, by the way, edible, and we did sell some to some and donated others, so it wasn't a total waste. But those are plants that are, you know, that's a measure of how of the warmth of the high tunnel, and that was just through natural lighting. There was nothing going on. That was just the sun coming through the through the plastic that covers it. And you know, mind you, the temperature in the high tunnel is typically at about 10 degrees higher than it is outside the high tunnel when the high tunnel is closed up. And you know, you get similar results in a low tunnel. And remember that your low tunnel can be rated to provide 3 degrees more of warmth to even 9 degrees more if you double and triple down. But it comes with, you know, consequences, and it, you know, you might have to do more work because you don't want to let them get too hot. I know that our kohlrabi crop, which loves the cool weather, They did well for a while. And then we didn't take the covers hard enough, quickly enough, and they became very unhappy, kohlrabies. So, and that's just, that's, you got to be mindful. And that's why, what is it, remember, write it down.
Oh my God. I
But
love that.
by the way, that's a daikon radish, and it's great to grow as a cover crop because it breaks up the soil. And incidentally, unlike a giant radish, normal radish, this remains easy to eat even at this size.
Yeah, that's the way it's best, I've heard. There's a question in the chat. There was you shared about cucumber seedlings in a milk container. And the question is, how can they get sunlight if they're under the milk container?
Can you repeat that question?
There was something you talked about cucumber seedlings under a milk container, and there's a question about how they get sunlight.
Oh, they get sunlight because that's through. They're not getting 100% sunlight, but given where they are at in their stage of growing, this was like April 1st. Normally, cucumbers wouldn't go out until often after Memorial Day, or sometimes mid-May. So you're talking about an entire month, more than a month ahead of time, because it's mid-May or late May. I didn't do this, and I didn't compare the harvest to a harvest that was for cucumbers later on. I do know that the cucumbers did very well under the high tunnel, but it is generally these fruiting crops do better on the cover, and in the case of the cutout gallon containers under the high tunnel or in a low tunnel, it is still meritorious. It's still they'll still get warmth, and they'll still get sunlight. Bottom line, they're not getting 100%, but they're getting enough to grow and to start off the season on the right foot. So I wouldn't worry about that, and you're not going to you're not going to do damage to them. As long as they'll tell you, they'll grow out and they'll kick the thing off. They'll push up against it. But you don't want that, but you won't need to worry about that. Now the question remains, again, because I didn't do the record keeping, I am not aware of any comparison studies from a agricultural college, which is, that would be important to tell whether at the end of the day, it made sense to start cucumbers under protection in a high tunnel or in a low tunnel. But I would say that, being the eager beaver that I am often, and that many of us are, that if you get out a little earlier before late May, it is a good idea to always keep your radar, focus on your weather radar, because you want to know if you're going to get a frost. You want to know if you are going to get a cool night below 50 degrees. And then you want to take some measures. Know that you have to take some action to protect an early started cucumber. If you don't, then you don't want to, you probably don't want to grow it. Or you can just make sure that you have a plan B if you lose your plants. And you can, cucumbers don't take a long time to grow. The same thing with summer squash, that you could really just start them in May, late May, and they'll be all right. And you could start them in June and be all right. You could even get a round started in July and you still get some harvest. Now, if you go early, and early, keep in mind that the last frost date often for our hardiness zone is mid May. I think May 12th is the date this year that they're projecting this year, which, if you're going to do it before May 12th and you're ready to do it before May 12th, you could really benefit from, and why not? You could benefit from using some season extension protection.
Any last questions for Apolo? Okay, well, thank you so much for sharing not only your knowledge, but your amazing pictures. And everyone should go visit Oasis on Ballou Urban Farm in Dorchester. They have volunteer days on Thursdays and Saturdays. Is that right?
That is correct. And we're very excited by what we have to do. What's on the task. We are adding some additional raised beds. You may have noticed that we use grow bags, and we're almost ready to transition totally into raised beds. And we do that in part because under Article 89 that deals with urban farming, it starts off by recognizing that the native soil is contaminated. And this is the way that we set it up, where we put wood chips down and then landscape fabric and then more wood chips, and then we put in a raised bed with clean soil. It is a good technique to use to be able to grow in the urban areas. Not the only one. I mean, obviously, if you have some funding, you could totally get rid of, excavate the contaminated soil that is likely, and then you can replace it. Speaking of which, we will be doing at Ballou a couple of soil health workshops. So I have my contact information. You can get it also from Annabelle, and be on the lookout for that, because we're hosting. We're not the soil experts. Soil experts are going to be folks from USDA, NOFA, and other organizations that have professors of soil, or professors of dirt, if there's such a thing, but people who are very knowledgeable in creating a healthier soil. And one of the practices that's very common, and which we didn't address, but it's something that you could be doing in the shoulders, is if you're not growing crops to eat, you can grow crops that will help you grow crops to eat in the future, and those are cover crops.
That's so exciting. Excited to hear about the dates for that. I'd love to.
Yeah.
I'd love to learn more always personally, and I know well, that'll be a good thing to share out with people. So just a reminder that the recording and slides for all these workshops will be available in follow-up email if you registered, and be sure to check out our so any recordings that you missed from earlier in the day. And then tomorrow we have 2 more sessions, one at 1 p.m. and one at 2:20 p.m. with 6 more great workshops. Don't miss it. Actually, another Oasis on Ballou employee is going to be talking about growing ajicitos dulces and making sofrito. So that, and doing a live sofrito demo. So don't miss that. And thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Apolo, again, for sharing.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day, everyone.
You
Bye.
too.